This is an afternoon update from 28storms.com and Hurricane Tracker app on newly formed Hurricane Rina in the Western Caribbean. Rina has strengthened more than expected over the last 24 hours. The reconnaissance plane just recently flew into the system and found maximum sustained winds of 75 miles per hour, making this a Category 1. As we go into the day on Thursday, the official forecast is taking the system rather close to the eastern half of the Yucatan Peninsula as a major hurricane. And as we go into the early part of this upcoming weekend, notice that they do take it more toward the northeast, so interests in Cuba and southern Florida should also be paying close attention to this system. The latest Western Caribbean visible satellite imagery shows a developing eye and eyewall-like feature deep within the central dense overcast, so the system is well organized this afternoon. If we turn on the latest infrared, the convection does appear to be on the decrease, which is to be expected for this time of the day, but I would not be surprised if the convection begins to return during the overnight hours. And we do have a lot of dry air, especially to the northwest of the system, but we must also keep in mind that this hurricane is over some of the warmest waters in the Atlantic Basin, so that will allow the system to continue developing intense convection despite that dry air being present nearby. On a more regional scale, we've talked over the last 2 to 3 days about how an additional round of upper-level ridging was coming in from the Eastern Caribbean, and in a moment you will see that much of the Caribbean is now being dominated by one upper-level ridge, so that part of the forecast was correct. It just happened to build in just a little bit faster than anticipated, so now Rina has very favorable upper-level winds to work with. In addition, we still have this trough over the southeast Gulf of Mexico, but it's still far enough away to where it's actually enhancing the poleward outflow jet, and you can see all of the exhaust from the hurricane being evacuated over much of Cuba and the Bahamas, and that is a very favorable pattern for steady or even potentially rapid development. Here is that SIMS wind shear chart, and once again the upper level ridging is now taking up the better part of the entire Caribbean, and just to the northwest of our system we have quite a lot of southwest wind shear, but again it's just far enough away to where it's acting as a poleward outflow jet, so this system has very favorable upper level wind over the extremely high octane fuel of the warm waters of the Western Caribbean. So Rina is more than likely going to become a major hurricane as currently being forecast by the Hurricane Center, but as of right now it's only a Category 1, so it's still being steered more so by the low to mid levels. Now this is the overall trend in the low level steering. We'll start off yesterday. Notice that we have low level ridging over western Texas, but over time this ridge is continuing to move more toward the east, and eventually this ridge is going to be over portions of the southeast United States coastline, and so therefore we could see a temporary turn more toward the west with Hurricane Rina, and that is the reason why the Hurricane Center is taking the system either over or very close to the eastern half of the Yucatan Peninsula. However, as we've already seen, Rina appears to be strengthening more than anticipated both by the forecasters and the available model guidance, so therefore within the next couple of days it could be more so the mid to upper level steering that will eventually dictate exactly where Rina is going to go. So if we look back at the latest water vapor across the United States, and again the water vapor is what tells us what is occurring best in the mid to upper levels, we see that yes, there is somewhat of mid-level ridging also present over Texas, and that is in line with what we are seeing at the surface. But there's also another feature that needs to be noted. Look at the troughing coming across over the Pacific Northwest. Over the next 2 to 3 days, this trough is going to continue diving southeast into the lower Mississippi Valley. And with Rina more than likely being a major hurricane by this point, this trough is more than likely going to steer the system quite possibly just to the east of the Yucatan Peninsula. It's probably going to make a curve right before the center reaches the coastline and then make that turn more toward Cuba or possibly even southern Florida. Now, certainly such a scenario like this would be very good news for interests here in Honduras, Belize, and the eastern half of the Yucatan Peninsula, but before we get carried away with such an idea and become overconfident, I must stress that all interests here need to be bracing for hurricane conditions in the event that this turn does not occur as quickly as I think it will, and so therefore you need to be ready for the worst case scenario. On the flip side, this certainly would raise some concerns across western Cuba and southern Florida, but there's also some potentially good news. Now bear with me because this is an extended forecast and you need to be as at least cautious as possible right now as the forecast is subject to change. But if the storm were to get turned more toward the northeast and end up in the southeast Gulf of Mexico, we already see that there's quite a lot of dry air and wind shear in place, and the upper level environment is not going to become more conducive with that second trough beginning to sweep on down. In fact, the storm would have a better chance of maintaining its intensity if it took a turn more toward the northeast over Cuba versus making it all the way into the southeast Gulf, where it will be facing stronger wind shear. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at the latest 12Z model guidance, starting off with the CMC model. The first problem right off the bat is that the model is not seeing the true intensity of the system, and so therefore it's more prone to turning the storm more toward the west-southwest as it's being dominated by the low-level steering layer, which is going to turn out to be inaccurate. So as of right now, the CMC solution is being thrown out, and the next model we will look at is the 12Z run of the GFS model. This is the 850 millibar relative vorticity, and the model does a little bit better with the storm's depiction. It's a little bit more intense, and so therefore it takes it a little bit more toward the northwest than what the CMC is indicating. But notice that it gets thrown back toward the south, and that is because the storm is not quite intense enough in the model for that mid-level trough to pick it up, and instead it's still being steered more so by the low to mid-levels, which may still be inaccurate. And just for good measure, this is the GFS sea level pressure forecast, and as we advance this all the way throughout the next 7 days, the lowest minimum central pressure is into the upper 990s or lower 1000s based on this model, and that's going to be incorrect because the storm's current pressure is already down to 991 millibars. And finally, the last thing I will show you in regards to the GFS forecast is the positioning of the mid-level trough. Here it is over the Pacific Northwest, and that is in agreement with what we saw on the water vapor. And as we advance this just a little bit over the next few days, notice here by 72 hours the trough is now advancing over New Mexico and western Texas. And as we advance this just a little bit more, notice that we have a rather large trough over much of the southern United States between days 4 and 5. And if we're dealing with a much stronger system than the model is currently showing here, then it's going to have a greater tendency to get picked up by that trough and get sent more toward the east-northeast or northeast later on in the forecast period. The next model run is the 12Z ECMWF, and much like the other models, it's still struggling to pick up the actual intensity of the storm. The lowest central pressure here is 1007 millibars, and as we go into Tuesday and Wednesday, it is showing the system making that westerly track. However, once again, if it's a little bit stronger, it may actually come in a little bit more toward the north of where this model is currently showing. And as we go into Thursday, notice that the troughing is beginning to return to the southern plains already. And by Friday, this is quite possible. Look at the attending cold front here with the mid to upper level trough. So we have a front draped across the Gulf of Mexico, and out ahead of this system, the upper level winds are more than likely going to become increasingly unfavorable. And looky here, once again, by Friday, the model is not even showing a tropical cyclone in the southeast Gulf or northwest Caribbean, signifying that the storm has dissipated. So just to sum up everything, Rina is likely to become a major hurricane. All interests along the eastern coast of the Yucatan should be bracing for a hurricane toward the second half of this week, despite the good possibility that it very well could make that recurvature toward the northeast right before making a landfall. And interest in southern Florida and especially western Cuba should still be paying attention to this system, although as it looks right now, if it does make that northeast turn and heads more towards southern Florida, it will do so as a significantly weakening system due to the dry air and wind shear involved over the Gulf of Mexico. If this were to impact anyone as a significant system as it makes that turn toward the northeast, it would have a greater chance of doing so over western Cuba, where the wind shear would not be quite as strong. But again, this is a very complicated and complex pattern, so please stick with the official forecasts as they come out every 6 hours. Again, you can go to hurricanes.gov for the latest products from the National Hurricane Center, and please use 28storms.com and the Hurricane Tracker app as a supplementary source for information throughout the duration of this storm's life cycle.